I'm Sharon Macklis at IDG Communications, here with episode 56 of Do More with R, Plot in R with eCharts for R. ggplot is still my go-to for static plots, but I'm always on the lookout for new ways to make interactive graphs, tables, and maps. eCharts for R is one of my new favorite packages for that. It's intuitive, powerful, and flexible. The package is an R wrapper for the eCharts JavaScript library. JavaScript eCharts is now an official Apache Software Foundation project. It graduated from incubator status in December. That helps me feel confident I can rely on the JavaScript code underlying the R package. So let's take a look at eCharts for R. Package author John Kuhn explains the basics in this Getting Started page. First thing to know, every function in the package starts with E underscore. You begin a visualization by creating an eCharts object with the E underscore charts function. That has a data frame as the first argument and the x-axis column as the second argument. John uses a pipe format in his examples, so I'll follow his style in my demo. Data frame name and pipe on the first line, E underscore charts with the x-axis column on the second, and the type of chart, in his example, a line chart, with the y-axis series column on the third line of code. So let's take a closer look at how this works. For data in these first demos, I downloaded and wrangled some housing price info by US city from Zillow. If you want to follow along, details are in this video's related article. Houses underscore wide has columns for month. I'm just looking at December for each year, starting in 2007, for 9 cities. So let's start with the basics. In this code, first I load the eCharts for R and dplyr packages. Note I'm using the development version of eCharts for R, which I installed from GitHub to access the latest version of eCharts JavaScript functions. My first step is to create an eCharts object with my data frame, in this case houses underscore wide. If you're familiar with ggplot, this first step is similar. It creates an object, but there's no data in the visualization yet. You can see the x-axis but no y-axis or data here. But look carefully at the x-axis. I didn't have to worry about text labels on top of each other. eCharts automatically displays only some of the x-axis values if there's not enough room for all of them. So let me show this in RStudio where it'll be easier to see. I'm going to copy this code, switch to RStudio, paste it in, run that, open it in a browser, and now you can see the x-axis is responsive as I narrow my browser window and expand it. Next, I'll add the type of chart I want. For a line chart, that's the E underscore line function. That needs at least one argument, the column with the values. The argument is Serie, that's S-E-R-I-E, as in singular of series. There are a lot of other chart types you can choose, including bar, area, scatter plots, box plots, histograms, heat maps, tree maps, even word clouds or pie charts, and a lot more. Even more than I've listed here. You can see the full list on the package website or in the help files. Each of these functions takes column names without quotation marks as arguments. That's similar to how ggplot works, but most functions listed here have versions that take quoted column names. That lets you use variable names as arguments. John calls these escape hatch functions, and they have an underscore at the end of the function name, like you see here. The regular E underscore line function takes an unquoted column name. The escape hatch with the underscore takes the quoted column name. Here, I created variables for my X and Y columns and then used E underscore chart underscore and E underscore line underscore to use those variables. This makes it very simple to create functions out of your chart code. Next, I'll go back to my line chart and add a second city with another E underscore line function. There are no tooltips displaying here by default, but I can add those with the e_tooltips function. Notice that commas are added to the tooltip values by default, which is nice. But the tooltip here could be even more useful if I could see both values at the same time. I can do that with the tooltip argument trigger equals axis. I can turn this into a grouped bar chart just by swapping in e_bar for e_line. Did you notice how the numbers on the y-axis have commas by default? Very handy not to have to add that in manually every time. You'll probably want to customize the colors for your graph at some point. There are 13 built-in themes, which you can see on the eCharts for our website. So let me change themes on my graph. First, I'm going to save the graph in a variable called p, so I don't run out of screen space. I can add the B-inspired theme to my P chart with e_theme, B equals inspired. B-inspired. You can also create your own theme or modify an existing one, and there's an online tool to help. Let's say I like most of the colors here on this theme, but not the background. I can go into the basic config area and, let's say change this to an ivory background. I can also change one of the colors I might not like. Maybe this one. To use this, I need to download the resulting theme JSON file. So I'll click the download button, JSON tab, and copy that. Now I need to save that. I can go into RStudio, paste that in. And if I want, I can call that Westeros2.json. It needs to be .json, not .javascript. I've already got one. I'll use that and I'll replace it. Now I can use my customized theme with the e_theme_custom function to add my theme to the graph. Okay, now I'm looking at this. I think that ivory background is terrible on this graph. I can change to another theme, or I can simply customize it with the e_color function and background argument. But because a theme is just a JSON file, let's take another look at that. It's pretty human readable, so it should be fairly easy to tweak it yourself and create a theme with everything you want. You don't need to use a theme to customize your graph. You can set line colors with the e_color function. The first argument for eColor is a vector of colors for your lines, bars, points, whatever. Here I first create a vector of 3 colors. You see I can use color names or hex values. Got names here and a hex value. Then I just add that vector to e_color as the first argument. As you see here, I'm saving this new graph as variable p to make it easy to swap in new colors. I don't see our color brewer palettes built into eCharts for R the way they are in ggplot, but it's easy to add them yourself. Here I loaded the R Color Brewer library and then created a vector of colors with the brewer.pal function. I want 3 colors using the Dark 2 palette, one of my favorites. Now those are my colors in the graph. By the way, this same format lets you use the R Palettier package to access a load of R palettes from a lot of different palette packages. I can decide I want the first, second, and fifth colors from that colorblind palette for my 3-line graph. I can store those as a vector in my colors. And if you're not familiar with the Palettier package, the function Palettier_D accesses any of the available discrete color palettes. Here I want color_blind from the GG Themes collection, and I chose colors 1, 2, and 5 for my vector. If there are a lot of series, you probably don't want to type out each one by name with E_line or E_bar, and you don't have to. eCharts for R handles tidy data frames in long format elegantly too. In this next group of examples, I'll use a data frame in long format with condo price information. Columns are city, month, value, and home type. So check this out. I use dplyr's group by function on the data before running eCharts on it. And eCharts for R understands that. Now, if I tell eCharts to use month for the x-axis and value for the y-axis, it knows to plot each group as a separate series. I'm saving this graph to a variable called myplot. That legend at the top of the graph wasn't very helpful, though. If I wanted to find Tampa, I can mouse over it, but it's kind of hard to see with the other lines right near it. Even moving it on the side, it's still difficult, but let's take a look how I did that. Notice the 2 lines of code I added to my plot, E_grid and E_legend. That E_grid right equals 15% says I want my main graph visualization to have 15% padding on the right side. That's between the end of the graph area and the rest of my screen. The E_legend function says to make the legend vertical instead of horizontal, add a 5-pixel padding on the right and a 15% padding on the top. So that helps, but if I want to only see Tampa, scrolling over this, it's still very hard to see it, that line highlight because of all the other lines near it. I would need to click off every other line in order to see Tampa, which is kind of annoying. Some interactive data viz tools let you double-click an item to just show that one. eCharts handles this a little differently. You can add buttons to invert the selection process so you only see the items you click. To do this, I added a selector argument to the E_legend function. I saw those buttons in a sample eChart JavaScript chart that used selector, but it's not built-in functionality in eCharts for R, as far as I know. John only hard-coded some of the functionality in the wrapper, but we can use all of eCharts JavaScript functionality with the right syntax. So here's a quick detour for a little how this works under the hood. Here's an example John has on the eCharts for R site. You can see the original eCharts JavaScript documentation at the top, tooltip.axispointer.type. Tooltip is an available eCharts for R function, E_tooltip, so we can use that in R. Axis pointer is a tooltip option, but again, as far as I know, it's not part of the R package. One of axis pointer's options is type, which can have a value of line, shadow, none, or cross. So now we need to translate that JavaScript into R. We can do that by using axis pointer as an argument of tooltip. Here's the important part. For the value of axis pointer, we create a list with the list content type equals cross. If you know how this works, you have all the power and flexibility of the entire eCharts JavaScript library, not only the functions and arguments John coded into the package. Quick review. Here's what the JavaScript documentation looks like. And here's how we should translate it into R for eCharts. To create 2 selector buttons, this is the JavaScript syntax. And here's the R syntax. Each key value pair gets its own list within the selector list. Everything's a list, sometimes nested. That's it. So let's check out how the buttons work now. I do invert, I hit Tampa, I've only got Tampa, and now I can reset. Okay, let's turn to something a little easier, a title for our chart. eCharts4R has an e_title function that can take arguments text for the title text, subtext for the subtitle text, and also link and sublink if you want to add a clickable URL to either the title or the subtitle. If I want to change the alignment of the headline and subheadline, the argument is left. Left can take a number for how much padding you want between the left edge and the start of the text, but it also can take center or right for alignment, as you see here. Left equals center isn't very intuitive for new users, but it does make some sense if you know the reasoning behind it. Here's what left equals 10% looks like. Next up, sometimes you want to color by group. For these next demos, I'll use a data set with columns for the city and month, value for condos, value for single-family homes, and region, which I just made up for purposes of coloring by group. That's not a Zillow thing. Here's a scatter plot to see if single-family and condo prices are moving together. If I use dplyr's group by on the data before creating my scatter plot, the plot is colored by region. I'm also able to set my dot size with symbol_size. I've added something else to my plot, a few toolbox features. You can see them at the top right of the graph here. I've got zoom, zoom reset, data view, and download. I'll need to run this in RStudio so you can see how they work because they won't work in the slide. So let me open RStudio, paste that code in, run that graph, and open it in a browser window. If I click zoom, I can click and drag to zoom, and reset resets the graph. Clicking the data view lets me see all the data behind the graph. I could even copy it and paste it back into another analysis program like R. I can close that, and this will let me download. eCharts4R also has some statistical functions for your data visualizations. Here I'm adding a linear regression line with E_LM. There are a couple of other statistical functions, including error bars. Now I'd like to close this tour of eCharts4R with some animations over time. For these demos, I'm going to use data from the US CDC on COVID vaccinations by state, doses administered compared to vaccine doses received, to see which states are doing the best job of getting vaccines they have into people's arms quickly. This data has columns for state, total distributed, that's how many vaccines the state received, total administered, how many were given to people, report date, used, which is just administered divided by distributed, percent used, and a column for what color I want each state to be. The bars will all be the same color except for the state I want to highlight, in this case Massachusetts, if I choose to do that among the 6 states in the data set. Here's code for an animated timeline. If I group my data by date, add timeline equals true to the eCharts and autoplay equals true to the timeline options function, I get an autoplaying timeline. Timeline equals true is a very easy way to animate data by time in a bar graph. In the rest of this code, I set the bars to be all one color using item style and a list with color equals the color I want. The rest of the code is more styling. Turn the legend off, add labels for the bars with E_labels, add a title with a font size of 24, and leave 100 pixel space between the top of the graph grid and the top of the entire visualization. Here's a look at the full chart since the code cut off the bottom on the slide. And you can stop this, pick where you want to look, and so on. Animating a line chart is as easy as adding the E_animation function. Charts are animated by default, but you can make the animation duration longer to create a more noticeable effect. I need to refresh the slide so you can see the animation when the page loads. That duration equals 8,000 milliseconds. Let's it go on for 8 seconds. This is one of the coolest chart types, racing bars. It's available in eCharts JavaScript version 5. When I recorded this, you needed the GitHub version of eCharts for R to use version 5 JavaScript features. So this here is a GIF because my racing bars don't render properly in my slide. But let me copy and paste the code and run it in RStudio so you can see that it works. I'll be going over the code after. Let's copy and paste that. Open RStudio. Run that. And there are my racing bars. So let's go over the code. Here's the start of the racing bars. It's a basic bar chart with timeline equals true. Everything should look familiar by now. I start with my data frame, then use dplyr's group by to group the data by date. You have to group by date for timelines and racing bars. Then I create an eCharts object with state as my x-axis with timeline equals true, and add E_bar to make a bar chart using the %used column for my values. The only new thing I've added here is real-time sort equals true. This highlighted code within E_bar is just setting a black border around my bars. That's not necessary, but I know some people like to do that, and I wanted to show how it's done. I also turned off the legend since it's not helpful here. The next lines of highlighted code flip the graph from vertical to horizontal bars. E_y_axis inverse equals true sorts the bars from highest to lowest. This next group of highlighted code adds a value label to the bars at the inside right position. All the formatter equals code lines are using JavaScript to make a custom format for how the labels appear. In this case, I'm adding a %sign. That's optional. But the format syntax is useful to know because you can use the same syntax to customize your tooltips. params.value0 is the x-axis value, and params.value1 is the y-axis value. You can concatenate values and strings together in JavaScript with the +sign. John has more info about this on the eCharts for R website. E_add is where I map the colors in my data's color column to the bars using item style. This is different from ggplot and may take a little getting used to if you're a Tidyverse user. Finally, I add my title and subtitle, including a clickable URL for the subtitle. And I add some padding around the graph grid and the headline so they don't all run into each other. And there you have it. The racing bars. You can see if I mouse over this that this is clickable. So that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this introductory tour of eCharts for R. For more R tips, including a link to the article associated with this video, head to bit.ly/domorewithR. That's bit.ly/domorewithR, all lowercase except for the R. Hope to see you next time. Stay healthy and safe, everyone.